This is going to be a quick introduction to the SpecView recipe system, starting with a simple recipe to a single controller, moving on to recipe send to multiple controllers or machines, and also finally covering virtual instruments that make the send to facility work a little better. So I've got an existing configuration here that's got 3 identical programmer controllers into it, so I'm going to make a recipe screen. The way that we make a recipe screen is just going to include parameter names. We put down on the screen the things that we want. So this particular controller it's a very simple one. It's just got a target and a time. So I'm going to stick the target and the time out here and make them a bit wider, and then step 1's target and time. Oh, that's got names. The reason I put the name out in the first one and not second one is so that we can just see what they are. So there's segment 2 and there's segment 3. That will do. Let's just move that down a bit, or up a bit. In order to put these values into recipe, I need to ungroup them. So having put them out on the screen as I want them, I can ungroup them. Then I'm going to move these just a little bit to the side. Okay, and I'm going to put some text on the screen. It says segment 1. I copy that there and copy it there. And just edit this to say segment 2 and segment 3. Okay, it's not pretty, but it's functional. Let's just save that. So you can see that I'm online and I've got some numbers in there. So it's a very simple recipe taking 1 minute or 1 second, I'm not sure which. Can't tell, never mind. In order to put things into recipe, use the knife and fork cursor to put things into recipe, and you click on the items on the screen that you want in recipe, and then come out of that. So those items are now in recipe, and when we go into runtime and go into recipe, so when we go into recipe management, we can see the values are highlighted, and here's our list of recipes, which these are just the current values. So I could save the current values as my first recipe. I can then edit these values, so let's say 10, 20, 30. Silly recipe, but there we are, and save as my second recipe. Okay, if we flip between the first one and the second one, we'll see different values, and we can send these values down, either the first set or the second set, and so on. Once the values have been downloaded, this programmer controller could then be asked to run the recipe, but that's not part of what this video is about. So what you can see here is that you can have a bunch of recipes. There's all sorts of other things, importing and exporting, but I won't cover those. They're all in the manual, which you can find from SpecView's help. Recipes, using recipes, how to set them up, descriptions, all that fun stuff is there. So let's get rid of that. Now these recipes are going to just that one controller. If I come back out of recipe mode and go back into edit mode, so it's only programmer 1. So these values are for programmer 1. The recipe will only send the values to programmer 1, but I have 3 programmers, so I could set up recipe send to that allows me to send a recipe to one of the other controllers. So to do that, I need to put a button on the screen whose action is to go into recipe and send to mode. As you can see, you can also invoke the recipe manager in read-only mode, so if the recipes are not allowed to be edited by the operators, you can put a button on the screen that prevents that, but I'm just going to have them fully editable, and I'm going to make it send to. Okay. Now the important part about send to is that it will only send to instruments of exactly the same type. So in my particular case, if I hover over this item, we can see, that's probably just off screen, we can see on the top line at the far right hand end it's a type delta DTB, as is programmer 2, as is programmer 3. All the instruments have to be the same type. If they're of different types you can't use send to. So let's go into runtime. So instead of invoking recipe from the menu up here, I'll invoke it from here in send to mode. It looks exactly the same, except that the button that was marked send is now marked send to. So I can pick my recipe. When I click send to, we can see that SpecView's prompting with here's where the recipe is supposed to, or where it comes from and normally goes to, but I can send it to one or more other instruments. And if I send it, down it's gone to both of those other instruments. Now the danger with this is that because the recipe is written on the screen around programmer 1, it's possible for an operator to, instead of selecting that he wants it to go from programmer 1 to programmer 3, he might send it accidentally to programmer 1 as well. And there's a way around this, which is called virtual instruments. So let's go out of edit mode. Now this recipe on the screen, as mentioned before, is all about programmer 1. So whatever you click on up here, you can see what it is down here. So it's tied in to programmer 1, which in my case is a real programmer, but we want to have a virtual instrument. So what I'm going to do is, and you would normally do this first rather than last, but I'm going to rename or repurpose this programmer 1 as a virtual instrument. Oops, I didn't mean to put it on the screen. And the way that you do that is to choose the properties of it, and instead of putting the programmer on a real COM port at a real address, at the top of the list are virtual and offline. In this particular case we want virtual. So I'm going to call this, instead of programmer 1, I'm going to call this virtual programmer. Save. Close. So now when I go online, all the values are marked as virtual because this instrument doesn't exist. So there are no current values. But the reason for this is that if you wanted to send a recipe to the virtual instrument, because it doesn't exist, they all have to be set to no change. So that's what that message is about. So if I load the first recipe, I can send it to programmer 2 or 3, whichever. So it's coming from the virtual going to 2 or 3. So there's no danger in downloading the recipe to the instrument that created it on the screen, because this instrument is now a virtual instrument and cannot be harmed. If I wanted to put my programmer 1 back in, I could just create it again. So there's my programmer 1. So this recipe is all about the virtual instrument, and when I send it to, I can send it to programmer 1, the real one, programmer 2, the real one, and or programmer 3, the real one, any combination of them. Off we go. If the instrument, or if the machine that you have has multiple controllers in it, so maybe it's a multi-zone furnace and you've got several controllers on each one, then the send to screen will have many source instruments on the left hand side, and the operator will have to match them up on the right hand side, but that's kind of an advanced thing, not for the scope of this. So there we are, a quick run through of how to put things into recipe, how to send them to the source controller, and then how to make them into virtual instruments and use send to download a recipe to an instrument of exactly the same kind. If the instruments are of different kinds, then you will need to create separate recipe screens for the different classes of instruments, because send to doesn't know how to map the values from one type of instrument to another type of instrument. There is also a way to limit the number of instruments on the send to side. For example, you could have, let's say you've got two different processes. They could be annealing or hardening or quenching or something like that, and only certain devices can take a certain kind of recipe. There is a way to limit the list of target instruments on the right hand side in this list, but that's outside the scope of this video. Please contact support@specview.com if you need to know how to do that. There we go.